It looks like we're right at 1 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. So we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Dana Render, and I'm the Director of Education for Trees Atlanta. And this is part of our virtual speaker series. And today we're going to be talking about barriers of nature engagement for youth of color. For those of you who don't know Trees Atlanta, we are a nonprofit and our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forest. And we do that through planting efforts, conservation, and also education. Two of today's speakers, we have Dr. Don Rakow, who's the Associate Professor of Horticulture with the School of Integrative Plant Science with Cornell University. And he's going to be sharing some of his research today about these barriers to nature engagement for youth. And then we also have Ebony Preston, who is the Director of Operations for the Greening Youth Foundation. And she will give us a localized example of what's going on here in Atlanta, Georgia, and their efforts to help youth of color to engage in nature. So we know that you may be watching in a variety of places today. If you're in our Zoom room, we have a Q&A button where you can submit questions for either or both of our speakers today. If you have a question that is specific for one person, make sure you put their name or organization in that question, or it can be answered by both of them if you have it. And also our chat is interactive. If you're looking on our live stream with YouTube, you can also participate in our chat with questions there, and we will moderate as you ask. We also want to make sure that we're serving you better. There's going to be a survey that comes out to you after the end of this presentation. And so we ask for your feedback so that we can offer classes and presentations that suit your needs and desires. And if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And you can also learn about other activities as well as volunteering and other education opportunities, just like this one at treesatlanta.org. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rakow. And I think you're on mute, Dr. Rakow.
Thank you so much, Dana. It's really an honor for me to have this opportunity to present to your audience today, and I'm very appreciative to Trees Atlanta for this opportunity. I'm speaking to you today from my office at Cornell University on the traditional native lands of the Cayuga Nation, which is part of the original Haudenosaunee Confederation, and want to acknowledge that all of Cornell's activities occur in these traditional lands. I need just a moment to pull up a PowerPoint. And I assume that you all can see that now. I'm going to be primarily reporting on a Hatch multi-state grant that I've conducted with my wonderful colleagues, Dr. Dorothy Ibes from the College of William and Mary on the left, and our research technician, Mr. Chris Kim, on the right. Our motivation for becoming involved with this study really goes back to the fact that there have been so many reports in recent years about all of the ways in which time spent in nature is beneficial to young people. from reducing stress levels, blood pressure, heart rate, to increasing sleep patterns, cognitive ability, memory recall, and even overall mood. And yet, a number of studies have shown that participation in the outdoors, in natural spaces, by young people of color is at much lower rates than it is among white audiences. In fact, in one study that was conducted by the Outdoor Foundation, it found that only 9% of young African Americans regularly spend time in nature versus 73% of white audiences. So we went into this project with two primary research goals. One, to identify the common barriers that exist for young people of color from visiting parks and other nature sites. And two, to develop and disseminate a list of best practices based both on our findings and on a review of the literature for increasing engagement in young people of color in the outdoors. In terms of methodology, we and our research technician interviewed community leaders in 5 urban centers in upstate New York and in Virginia. We then followed that up by interviewing leaders from nature serving sites who have been successful in overcoming one or more of those barriers in terms of engaging young people of color. And here you see Brittany Council, who is a 4-H youth development educator in Richmond, Virginia, and one of our interviewees. So we posed a number of questions to each of the individuals who we interviewed. One sample question was, what do you estimate is the average distance between where young people in your community live and a publicly accessible park or green space? A second question was, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you generally assess the condition of the parks and other green spaces within your community? And there you see illustrated an example of a park that is in very poor condition. A critical question was, what do you feel are the primary impediments to youth of color spending more time in parks or nature sites or green spaces in general, or impediments to interacting more with nature in your community? And there you see pictured one of the individuals we interviewed in the second phase of the research, Carolyn Schuyler, who's the founder and director of Wild Rock Nature Play Center. Once we had gathered all of this extensive interview data, we used a program called NVivo to analyze trends in the interview data, to identify particular terms which came up with frequency. That allowed us to then identify how youth of color are spending their non-classroom time, as well as to identify key barriers to park use. What did we find out? We found that, to no one's surprise, utilizing technology was the #1 way that young people of color have been spending their non-classroom or non-program time. In fact, 12 of the 13 community leaders we interviewed indicated that this was the #1 use of discretionary time. 8 of the 13 respondents indicated that youth will typically spend time in organized programming, that is, after school sports, club activities, extracurricular activities, recreational centers, or personal hobbies. And then 5 of the 13 participants mentioned that youth with whom they work are generally at home or indoors, hanging out with friends, etc. What's interesting to note from this data is what it doesn't explicitly include. Based on our interviewees, youth of color do not generally spend their non-school time at parks or green spaces if there are no organized activities involved, such as athletics, games, or events. So when youth of color do use parks and green spaces, how are they generally using that space? The top priority by far was for use in organized sports. 12 of the 13 respondents mentioned that the availability of various recreational courts and fields were highly, highly desirable. Water recreation, such as swimming in pools, fishing, boating, was mentioned by 8 of the 13 participants, highlighting that this was also a very important priority for parks by youth of color. Now, while 8 of the 13 interviewees also reported that youth appreciate having features like beaches, trees, and wildlife, only 38% of the respondents indicated that youth of color they work with regularly interact with nature itself, such as taking nature walks, observing plants, or wildlife. So on the one hand, youth of color are appreciating having beaches and green spaces. On the other hand, only about 1/3 of them are regularly using such spaces for things like nature walks. As we further analyzed the data, we found that there are 3 primary categories of barriers that are preventing young people from making greater use of parks and green spaces. And these fall into 3 primary categories: external factors, social factors, and psychological barriers. The #1 external barrier that was cited was accessibility or lack of accessibility, cited by 11 of the 13 interviewees. Now, factors that make up this accessibility issue are things like a total lack of nearby nature or green space, or parks that are nearby but difficult to walk to because it's impossible to cross major thoroughfares, such as is depicted here, or dangerous neighborhoods that need to be negotiated in order to get to the park, or parks that are locked when youth of color desire to use them, such as in the evening hours. A second factor in external barriers has to do with insufficient programming or facilities. I already mentioned that the most desired feature in parks was having ballparks or courts or places where organized sports could be conducted. If such facilities don't exist in nearby parks or green spaces, or if they're in a very degraded condition, like broken hoops, broken playgrounds, rusty play equipment, then that's going to be a very strong disincentive to the use of those particular spaces. Next, we get to psychological barriers. And number one among psychological barriers, cited by 11 of the 13 interviewees, was fear of other people. That can be fear of police, fear of other park users, even fear of other youth. So that's a big barrier to overcome, and I'd like to come back to it later in this presentation. Also ranking high were expressed preferences for other types of activities. I already cited that when youth of color have non-program time, often they're on screens, whether that's for video games, social networking, or other use of screens. And I'm pleased that fortunately only 39% of respondents indicated that youth of color don't engage with parks and green spaces more because of an aversion to nature. Finally, we have the socioeconomic barriers. And first among these was social exclusion. Let me explain what I mean by that. Social exclusion can reflect a feeling of being unwelcomed or displaced or unaccepted in green spaces and parks. It may be caused by having all of the signage in a language that is different from the one which is spoken in the home. Or it could be because all of the park personnel are white and not reflecting the ethnic or racial diversity of would-be park users. Or it could be as a result of active discouragement by those park employees for the preferred activities by youth of color in those parks. Secondly, a lack of resources can be anything from not having the proper equipment in local parks, not being able to afford bus fare to access parks, not having a car to drive to the parks, or having to work to support the family unit. Finally, lack of exposure. The interviewees indicated that often this is as a result of youth of color spending most or all of their time in their urban neighborhoods and simply not having experience with natural spaces and finding them unfamiliar as a result. So to summarize, what we found was that the primary barriers were accessibility, reported by 89% of respondents, preferences to spend time in other ways, reported by 72%. A lack of resources, also reported by 72%. As I said, somewhat encouraging that only 39% reported an aversion to nature, but insufficient programming or facilities is a really big factor, reported by 67%. And in one report that I read recently, which analyzed all park and green spaces in New York City, it found that surprisingly, parks and green spaces were more prevalent in areas primarily populated by people of color than in neighborhoods that were primarily white. But those parks and green spaces in neighborhoods that were primarily of people of color had insufficient programming, very poor facilities, and therefore were utilized less. And finally, as I mentioned, degraded environments can be a significant discouragement to use of parks. How can we overcome these barriers? There is no single magic bullet solution, but there are multiple ways that we can make parks more welcoming and better equipped for meeting the needs of today's youth of color. One is to hire diverse, bilingual leaders, ideally from the local communities, and to incorporate bilingual signage. Often in US cities, that means bilingual Spanish signs, but in other communities, it can mean Chinese, that is Mandarin, or Korean. Secondly, require, don't suggest, but require that all park staff complete anti-racism, diversity, and inclusion training. Such training can go a long way toward increasing sensitivity, increasing understanding, and increasing communications between groups. Thirdly, increase outreach and marketing, particularly to communities of color. Some of the ways of promoting parks are that they provide space for neighborhood residents to interact with each other and meet new people, perhaps never more important than during the current age of COVID. There are also great spaces for events, and even socially distant events. Also, as more and more people use parks and recreational facilities, it has been shown to reduce crime rates, especially among youth. And finally, when parks are used by many people, there are more eyes on the street, which creates a safer environment for everyone. Very importantly, though, marketing campaigns must be packaged in appealing ways. They must use media like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, etc., and they must appear to be authentic. Another way to overcome the barriers I've spoken about is to improve transportation options for youth of color, perhaps making urban buses free, or at least those routes that go to area parks without cost. Promote equitable distribution of parks. Conduct a citywide park assessment to see which neighborhoods and communities are park deficient and direct new park development specifically to those neighborhoods. So in terms of next steps for this research, one outgrowth of it is that a colleague of mine from the University of Connecticut, Laura Brown, and I have developed a resource guide called Antiracism in the Outdoors. Resources related to inclusion, diversity, equity, and access of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in parks and green spaces. Individual components of this online guide are devoted to organizations, presentations and podcasts, affinity groups and resource lists, books, articles and reports, and ideas on how to be an effective ally. As Laura and I have been developing this resource guide, we've been extremely encouraged by the sheer number of organizations dedicated to increasing access to the outdoors by previously underrepresented groups. Just a sampling of some of the organizations that we include in the guide are Black Adventuristas, Black Girls Run, Brown Folks Fishing, Gateway to the Great Outdoors, Latino Outdoors, Green Muslims, and as you see pictured here, Outdoor Afro, where Black people and nature meet. And I believe that Trees Atlanta is putting up the link to this resource guide for everyone to use. In addition, Dorothy, Ibes, Chris Kim, and I are in the process of writing a book chapter for the upcoming book, The Power of Parks, on the best practices for overcoming barriers and engaging youth of color in parks, nature sites, gardens, and green spaces. But the work goes on. Each of us must explore ways of welcoming, engaging, and celebrating youth of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds into our parks, gardens, and green spaces. Because you know what? A tree does not recognize a person's color. And at this point, I am happy to turn things over to Ebony Preston of the Greening Youth Foundation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Rakow, for sharing your research. As I get started, I too just want to thank Trees Atlanta for giving us the platform today just to talk a bit about our work and what it is that we do. I'm very excited to join you all from Atlanta, Georgia, where I work with the Greening Youth Foundation as the Director of Operations. And so as Dana shared at the top of the hour, just want to share a little bit about our work and our initiatives and how we're working to break down those barriers for youth of color within these spaces. So for us, it starts in our mission, in that we're looking to engage diverse youth and young adults and expose them to careers and opportunities within conservation. And so we find with a lot of our youth, a lot with our elders even, that this isn't a new journey for them. They just have to be connected with it, or that we can't romanticize every relationship that people of color have had with nature, but that doesn't mean that they're not interested in that work. So making sure that we're creating those opportunities and support systems so that they're able to be successful within the space. And so I'll keep our conversation here today stateside, and that we do some work in West Africa, but within the United States, we have 3 programs: our Forever Green program, our Youth Conservation Corps, and our Urban Youth Corps. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of them. So here in Atlanta, we actually started as an environmental education organization where our founder and CEO she was in Snellville and she just wanted to do an Earth Day event with her son's school. And it just turned into something a lot bigger in that she saw that there was an opportunity to really work with these young people and tell them about the environment and make it personal, make it relevant to them so that they can become environmental stewards and share that knowledge and that best practice with their family and with their communities at large. And so over time, that program actually extended to the metro Atlanta area. And as you see, areas of South Carolina and in Ghana as well. And just again, having that conversation about, it's okay to go outside. It's okay to enjoy that space and take ownership in that space and be a steward of this land and share those best practices with your community. And then also in these conversations, we were talking about nutrition and what that looks like and understanding, where the eggs come from. They're not from the grocery store. There's an entire cycle there. But just for them to have that ownership of that information and seek to learn more. We also have a local effort, our Urban Youth Corps. And so this program is for local youth between the ages of 18 to 25 that maybe don't take the traditional route, if you will, of going to a 2 or 4-year university, but they say, hey, I still want to be a leader in whatever space that I feel. I'm interested. I'm not afraid to work hard. I just want to learn and I'm looking for opportunity. So we created our Urban Youth Corps in 2014. And so what we're doing is we're getting young people, we're bringing them to our farm in the West End of Atlanta, and we're training them on urban agriculture and horticulture and silviculture and giving them industry credentials and making sure that they're getting that professional work experience, that they're networking with people that have been in the field, that have been successful there, and so that they can take these skills and transfer them into whatever career path that they choose. So we have folks that are in tree care, that do landscaping, that do historic preservation in some of the programs that we've done. And we've seen a lot of success with that. We've also found that some people, young people that come through this program, they become our competitors in that they say, I do this really, really well and I want to keep doing it. So then they go to get contracts with like the city of Atlanta or just different vendors and spaces out there. And so we're very proud of those efforts. And again, showing that just giving these young people the opportunity in the space can lead to a lot of success for them. And as I said before, we have a 3.5-acre farm in West End where we do a number of these trainings. And so I mentioned before the agriculture there, we have a hoop house. We also do animal husbandry. We have our own irrigation system. So just really equipping these young people with the ins and outs of what it means to do this work. And then our biggest department is our Youth Conservation Corps. And so these are where our internships are housed, where we're working with a number of federal partners, some of which you see on the screen, but then also some environmental NGOs and some outdoor retailers to really give these young people some on-the-ground experience, or I guess here in the age of COVID, some virtual experience for a number of these positions, but giving them experience and opportunity to shadow behind professionals within the space and really do some meaningful work. So these internships for us aren't, your go make coffee or make copies. I certainly did those when I was an undergrad, but we're giving them rigorous projects that there's a lot of independence on that they're responsible for. So for advancing the mission of these different agencies and the work, and they're doing everything from hydrology to biology, but then also computer science and public policy and finance, but just because we're showing that within conservation, there's a number of different opportunities for people to get involved. And we're pushing these agencies to hire these young people, as Dr. Rakow said, so that they can see themselves within that work. And so our slogan, our hashtag with Greening Youth Foundation is sustainable diversity. And so I tend to ask people what they think that means, but in the webinar, we can't necessarily do that. So I'll just go ahead and say that we're looking at sustainability and we're looking at diversity. And so we talk about why. What's the why? Why do we do this work? Well, one, I say that diversity begets innovation, right? These young people are coming with a number of experiences and backgrounds and things that we shouldn't silence, but we should uplift. They're ready to do the work. They're equipped to do the work. It's just giving them the opportunity to do that. And so over the years, Greening Youth Foundation has been in operation for more than 10 years. And in that short amount of time, we've had over 3,000 positions through our internship program. We've worked with a host of partners from the federal agencies to colleges and outdoor industry partners, as well as the agencies that Dr. Rakow named, like Outdoor Afro. We're doing programming across the United States and the US territories. And then that number of hours of service is constantly growing day by day and well into the millions. So we're very proud of the work. And as I said, these young people continue to show up. So if it's in recreation or if it's in policy, they're doing the work, they're invested in the work, and they're very successful. And so for us, when Dana reached out and we were having this conversation about the barriers, I wanted to look at what gaps the Green Youth Foundation is filling. So what is the work for us? And so one, I'll start by saying that we're an organization that knows that it's one of those seeing is believing type of thing. Our leadership, our CEO and founder, Anjulu Azilo, is a graduate of Spelman College here in Atlanta, Georgia. And she made it a point to make sure that the young people that we're educating through our environmental education programs, or the young people that we're hiring, they see themselves in our staff. And so she's made a commitment to that and making sure that it's people that identify with the different narratives and perspectives that these young people are bringing with them. But just to go down the list kind of with the things that we do with our program. So opportunity and exposure. So as many of you that are working within this space, you find that kind of an internship is the on-ramp to these careers. And so we're making sure that we do that. And so we have, as I said before, a number of internships in a variety of fields, but still based in conservation or exposure. And so for our young people, our K through 12 programming, or even people that say, hey, I'm on that path to be a doctor or a lawyer, and I still want to do that, but I'm interested in this space. We have, we go on hikes. We have a legacy camp out that we do every year. It tends to be in Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, but obviously COVID this year, so we made it virtual. But just really showing young people and even adults in the community at large that there's opportunities to engage in this work. Compensation, that's a really big one. I say often to our partners, the day and age of free internships is over. So for that compensation piece, all of our internships are paid. And so that's not just an hourly rate, that is dependent upon where they are in the country, because rural Alabama looks a lot different than New York or California or DC, but then also giving them things like health insurance, housing stipends, commuting stipends. In some programs, there's even a meal stipend. And it's because we really want the young person to be able to focus on the work. As I said before, when they get the opportunity to show up, they show out. And we want to give them the space in the room to do that. And so we don't want the compensation to be a barrier. As I said before, a lot of them are also coming with a lot of the technical skills. So it's on our staff to add to those soft skills. But then once they're in the field as well, we're making sure that they continue to grow in those technical skills. As many of you know, professional networks is really, really important. It's not all the time what you know, but who you know. So making sure that these young people are getting in front of the right people so that they can make those valuable connections. As they're doing their work, they're getting industry credentials, they're meeting mentors and coaches, many of which, like I said, are internal to our staff. We're giving them uniform and gear. When we talk about people going camping, folks know it's very expensive. So we have a gear drive that we've done in great partnership with a number of outdoor retailers. And so when young people are onboarded in our programs, we say, hey, where are you going? Are you going to Grand Teton? Okay, it's really cold. Do you have a jacket? What does that look like? Do you have hiking boots? What do you need? Do you have a good backpack? Those things are really, really important. When we talk about the positions that we have in our internship program, we also we're a federal partner, so we're able to help in the issuance of non-competitive hiring authority certificate, which are huge when they talk about young people trying to transition into those permanent positions within the agency. And so that's been something that we've seen a lot of success with as our young people are transitioning into those roles. We offer a tailored webinar series, and then we also do a number of site visits just to check in to make sure that things are going well and continue to be an advocate in that space. And then finally, as much as we talk about the things like the money and the programming, things like that, I think I'm a social worker by training. So a lot of it is conversation, right? And authenticity. And so the first part here is the acknowledgement of the issue and letting young people know that we understand that, no, you're not crazy. There are systems and people and things that have kind of stood in the way of access to this space, and that we're here to support you on that journey. As I said, it's very important to our organization, but as well as our partners, to make sure that these young people feel empowered in this space and know that, that they have full support of organizations like ours. And so just acknowledging that work, we found, has meant a lot. We do a lot of relevant and intentional programming. We have a partnership with the National Park Service, and we started a program about 10 years ago, our Historically Black College and University internship program, that said, hey, we aren't finding that there are a lot of Black people, specifically students coming from HBCUs, that are working within this space. So let's call it out. And so we created this program within youth programs, and we've seen so much success. We've worked with over 75 parks. We've worked with over 50 HBCUs just to get these young people to have that experience over the summer. And fortunately, we found that a lot of them have been hired by the agency with that hiring authority that I spoke about before, and are now the supervisors for our current interns. So it's completely full circle, and we're very proud of that work. Dr. Rakow mentioned this earlier too, authenticity. People know when it's not genuine, right? And so making sure that we're being open to the conversations and getting that feedback to them, because we also have our blind spots, but being willing to change and having that agility and openness to seeing that we have to continue to evolve, that this isn't a conversation or a topic or work that's for right now because of all the madness that we saw, not that just started happening, but that we saw visibly on a national scale in 2020, but that these are people's lives, and that if we want to see change, we have to be a part of that change. So just being authentic in that work. And the last point that I'll mention here are just kind of making sure that it's multiple seats at multiple tables. So I know that we often use that and say giving someone a seat at the table, but there's a lot of conversations that these people, that we as people need to be a part of. And I think that just saying, okay, I'm going to give you this one opportunity to be successful, or I want you to listen into that, doing it often and doing it in a big, bold way, we have really seen the difference in making sure that we're empowering these youth so that they know that, yes, there will be hard days, or yes, there will be instances where we go into these spaces and I'm the only person that looks the way that I look, or think the way that I think, or coming from the neighborhood that I'm coming from. But for that to be empowering, to say that I'm doing this for so many that are going to come behind me. And so as a collective, we've really seen a lot of success in the work that Green Youth Foundation does. I'm very passionate about it, but I would say that it's similar to everyone else that's on the team, and that we're excited to be here and to be able to have conversation with you all. And I certainly welcome any questions that you have.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Rakow, and also Ebony, with your presentations about what you're doing. For Trees Atlanta, it's extremely important that we continue to network with lots of organizations that are addressing these issues. And it's been very informative to hear the research side of what's going on, and then also the practical side of what's going on. And it's very helpful for us, as well as we continue to try to address those issues with programs that we have, like our youth tree team, which is very similar to some of your internships, with employing youth to learn about nature, to earn money because it is a job, but also to partner with us to do things that mean something to them, and also give them a sense of community of where they are. So we love these experiences to help learn and inform our practices, and also to be able to share with our colleagues. So with that, we'll love to get into the questions, and there are a few that have already come in. So I believe this one's for you, Dr. Rakow. Did you compare perceived lack of access versus actual access?
So in the interviews, the question that we asked was, for the youth that you work with, is how far away do they need to go to get to a park or green space, and what barriers are there to they're accessing those spaces. And as I mentioned earlier, those can be physical barriers like a highway that is impossible to cross on foot. They can be safety issues, including safety within the neighborhood itself, but they can also be perceived issues. And we are living in a period in which parents and guardians are increasingly concerned about permitting their kids to go off and explore on their own. And that's true of neighborhoods across the country. So I would say it really is a combination of both real and physical access issues as well as perceived ones.
Awesome. So there's a question about sample size. So you mentioned a sample size of about 18 people. Is that sufficient enough to tell a good story?
A really good question. And in our case, it would have been very difficult to interview the youth themselves because there are restrictions on getting data from particularly younger than 18-year-olds. And that was really why we chose to work with the community leaders that work with those youth. So each of those community leaders were working with a large number of young people, and therefore we felt that the sample size was sufficient.
How many community leaders were you able to work with?
So we worked with 5 community leaders in New York and Virginia, 5 additional leaders of nature serving agencies, and then a number of individuals who work in those communities, like the 4-H leader who I had profiled.
And were the same questions asked of white youth to compare the questions that you were asking to the youth of color?
So the community leaders who we worked with, as well as the nature serving leaders we worked with, are primarily serving youth of color audiences rather than white audiences. And because traditionally white audiences have fewer issues with accessing and using parks and green spaces, we were actually less interested in getting data from those white audiences.
So these questions I'm going to kind of combine because they deal with marketing and networking. But could you go over which social media outlets that you had mentioned earlier in your presentation? And then for both of you, how are you creating authentic marketing to encourage diversity in the natural spaces?
You know, I've got one really simple response to that, which is work with members of the audience you hope to reach. Don't make assumptions about what type of messaging works with them, what media outlets they're using, what they find authentic or not. Let them be the judges of all that. And before we turn things over to Ebony, I just want to say that I was knocked out by everything your organization is doing. Really inspiring work, Ebony.
Thank you for that. And it really starts from our head. Angelou is a visionary and we so appreciate her work. So I will definitely share that with her. I'll say for media, it's really easy because as Dr. Rakow said, we get it from our students, right? And so we have a brilliant content manager, Yairo, who does all of our visuals. So we're on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and things like that. We have a podcast, sure. But the stories that we're sharing, the images that we're sharing, it's all coming straight from our students. So we require that they send us images as a check-in just to say, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? But it's also, as I said before, we're in the work is seeing is believing. So we say, hey, you don't know what type of inspiration that picture of you at a park standing beside Jose Gonzalez that was in your presentation, or Shelton Johnson at Yosemite that was in your presentation, standing next to those young people and say, hey, this is achievable. So like, as I said before, we just really show the images and the stories that the young people are sharing with us and putting them out there for the world to see.
And Ebony, continuing with you, how are you all able to recruit youth for your internships and other programs with Greening Youth?
That's the secret sauce. I'm kidding. So we partner with a lot of universities, a lot of on the ground partners, things like that, and just really meeting the young people where they are. For us, of course, we go to the programs when we talk about conservation and people immediately, think about STEM fields. Yes, of course, we have those positions all the time. But as I said before, we say conservation isn't just about STEM. There's so many other career paths within the work. And so we're going to other departments. We're going to the arts departments. You're going to the schools of journalism. We're going to the MBA schools and things like that and saying, hey, there too is opportunity for you to get in this space. So just getting creative in that recruitment and just finding young people, like I said, where they are.
And how can some of those of us who are working at outdoor organizations help you, Greening Youth, and also the youth you work with?
Yeah, so partnerships is something that we talk about often. And so we want to know, what is that relationship that you want it to look like? So sometimes it's, hey, we just need a volunteer to be at the camp out, or to help us pack backpacks, or to help with the gear drive. And so raising things there. Sometimes it's folks, hey, I just want to donate. That works too. Or I want to be a mentor in this space, or I want to do an information interview. I mean, the opportunity is kind of whatever you want it to be, but we welcome it. And I certainly invite you to reach out.
And we will definitely have contact information for both Dr. Rakow and Ebony that will be sent out with the recording of this presentation. So what is the top message, Ebony, that you want to share for the leaders of nature organizations and gardens, etc.?
I guess it's twofold, but know that people of color know this space. They just need the opportunity. So hire them. I think Dr. Rakow said that earlier too, and know that these are people that have been working in these spaces for years. They have the degrees, they have the credentials, they just didn't have the opportunity. They didn't know about it. So call them out, be very intentional with it, and give them the space and the platform to shine.
Can I add to that? I think sometimes messaging is incredibly important. So for a number of years, I served as the executive director of a unit of Cornell called Cornell Plantations. Well, that name, which dates back 60 years, was incredibly offensive to many, many people. Now, I'm happy to report that in recent years, the name has been changed to Cornell Botanic Gardens, but parks that are named for former slave owners, or parks that have a history of being sites where horrific things happened, those are messages that need to be actively overcome.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Just language, it's very important. And that's probably a whole nother webinar that we can talk about.
Yes.
Just in kind of the messaging that we use and with the coded language, right? And when we talk about certain groups and how we talk about them and not to them, or when we use certain words like thugs or urban and how we're really meaning black and brown. And Jose Gonzalez said this best. He said, black and brown doesn't mean broken. So just making sure that we're mindful of the language that we use and that there's so much power behind those words.
Agreed.
So I have a question about DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. It says, I like the idea of mandatory anti-racism and DEI training for all staff personally. However, Some of my colleagues have a good point that forcing people who are not ready to begin or continue the work won't be very successful. For my institution, it is voluntary but recommended by some of our leadership. How do we get to the point where it can be mandatory without negative feelings?
I guess my response to that would be too bad. We are at a point in our culture where everyone needs to receive this training. And in order for an organization to really move forward in an inclusive and fair manner, I feel like everyone does require this training. So I guess that's kind of a hardcore attitude, but it's certainly what I feel.
I agree with those sentiments 100% in that these are conversations about people, right? And so what does that say if we have a lot of people pushing back? I don't want to go in a room where we talk about equity. I don't want to go in a room where we talk about inclusion, or I don't want to figure out how that transforms our work. I think we have to do some inward reflection and say, are those the people that you want to work beside every day? And so maybe I'm biased, and I'm okay to be biased in that space. But I think that, again, this is conversations about people and the day-to-day and how we treat people and how to make sure that these rooms are accessible by all. So, oh well.
That's true. We are in a space now where it's vitally important that we see people as people, and that these conversations are not necessarily meant to offend anyone, but it is to shake up what your thinking is about and to change your perspective and realize that we should all have the same goal. So I love making that something that you have to do, but it is a journey for a lot of organizations. So it's good feedback. So this is a question going back to some of that research, Dr. Rakow. Can you speak on the decision to interview adult leaders rather than young folks that they work with directly? They wonder about how implicit bias may show up in the respondents' answers.
It's a really valid concern. And as I mentioned earlier, it can be very difficult to get permission from the institutional review boards, the IRBs, to interview youth younger than 18. So that really was the reasoning behind our working with community leaders rather than with the youth themselves. We feel that we gathered a depth and breadth enough of data that the data is valid. It also was very self-reinforcing. Most of the respondents had very similar conclusions, but yes, it would be great if possible to interview the youth themselves.
And with that, were any of the respondents to your surveys, how many did you get with those leaders and also the youth? And were they compensated in any way for the research that you were doing with them?
So no, we did not compensate any of the youth leaders or nature site leaders. They all volunteered to participate in the project. I think because they saw the value of the project and the data that we would be developing. And again, there were 5 community leaders, 5 nature site, and then several other community individuals.
Excellent. So someone asked about the aversions to nature. So I was surprised to see an aversion to nature listed as the top 3 barriers. Is there more anecdotal information to explain that? I had been making an assumption that aversion to nature was a misconception.
Well, Ebony spoke earlier about the fact that Black people and brown people know about nature. They are familiar with it, but we can't generalize about any group, any ethnic or racial group. And there certainly are young people who just have not had much exposure to nature, and as a result see it as foreign or full of bugs and creepy things. And I've seen a couple of papers that have come out specifically on this topic. My feeling is that if someone has not had previous experiences with nature, you introduce them very gradually and over usually a short amount of time, they will embrace it. Ebony?
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. And I think that's the whole purpose we have our environmental education program. And so when I say that, as you said, just very generally, just saying that Black and Browns have had a relationship with nature historically. But yeah, that's the exact reason why we have our legacy camp out, and that we go to these local schools and we say, hey, who wants to go camping? And they're like, no, there's going to be a bear. And we're like, not downtown Atlanta. You know, they're like, I don't want to deal with bugs. And so making sure that we're creating that safe space for them. And then what we find out is every time we do camping trips, they then want to come along. So just exposing them to that space, letting them, sometimes there will be bears, there will always be bugs. We're in the South, right? But showing them that it's okay and you can still manage and you can still have fun. So I think it's the exposure piece is certainly important in overcoming that. But it's something that can certainly be overcome.
Awesome. We have two more questions. One specifically is for you, Ebony. What are the cities that Greening Youth operates? Obviously, you're here in Atlanta, Georgia, but there are other places that you all have opportunities. Could you go over a few of those?
Sure. So yes, we're headquartered in Atlanta, but we do programming throughout the U.S. So I could tell you places like Rolla, Missouri, in Vallejo, California, and New York City, but we're everywhere, and it's really where our partnerships are. So sometimes it's in towns you maybe never heard of because we're at a unit or a refuge with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or we're at a big park like Statue of Liberty or Yosemite. And so it really just depends on where the program and partnership is, but we aren't afraid to go anywhere. And so we open that up if there's partners that want to look in working in different spaces and places.
Awesome. And this last question, it could probably be answered by both of you. It says, how are you gathering input from Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous people of color who are in the environmental sectors and young folks to help inform them of engagement strategies?
So I'll mention that we're on the verge of having the Antiracism resource guide that I spoke about earlier hosted by an organization that promotes outdoor adventure by people of color. So I think that that will be a way of getting that guide more widely disseminated, but also have it curated by individuals who can expand it in appropriate and valuable ways.
What we do is we listen and we put the young people in front of those leaders and we let them have the conversation. So as I mentioned before with our historically Black colleges and university internship program, at the end of the program, we have a culminating event, if you will, a workshop where they're able to present their work that they did with the national parks, but they're also in front of these key players and stakeholders and just having very real, authentic conversations. And so we had Rue Map of Outdoor Afro. We had Nathaniel from Partnership for Southern Equity. We had partners from the Core Network and district rangers from the Forest Service and the chief of youth programs from the National Park Service in front of our students. And they're being able to have that very authentic dialogue and just talk about their experiences, their vision, their perspective for the future. A few of our interns did SWOT analysis on their parks. So just sharing that information with them and giving them that platform to get those things out. Uh-oh, Dana, you're on mute.
We do that all day, right? We're all on these Zoom calls and you start talking and you're on mute. Thank you all for sharing this wonderful information. This has been extremely informative. I know that there are a lot of people who are listening right now who are from public gardens and other spaces and parks that want to engage more people and to make those spaces that they manage more inclusionary of people, because it really is for all of us. So I want to thank you, Dr. Rakow and Ebony, for sharing your wisdom, sharing what you're doing. Ebony, I'm sure I'll see you soon because we're in the same city. So it's wonderful to participate in another opportunity to amplify what other organizations are doing that we partner with. And we will be sending this presentation out, the recording out, to everyone who registered for the event. We'll also include that link with resources that Dr. Rakow mentioned. And we'll also include contact information for both of our speakers today and how to either connect more with the research or participate with organization. So I want to thank you all. I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. We look forward to more talks with everyone, and also especially on this topic, so that we can all be organizations that promote nature for all. Y'all have a great day.
Thanks so much.